All right, I have 12 o'clock, so I'll get started as people are still coming in through the waiting room. Good afternoon. Welcome to the third installment of Preservation Connecticut's Fall 2021 series of talking about preservation, our noontime chats about everything preservation. I'm Jane Montanaro, Executive Director of Preservation Connecticut, and I'm delighted to be your host as we have the opportunity to chat with Dr. Don Poland on unconscious influence, Olmsted's Hartford. Before I turn the controls over to Don, let me give you a brief intro into Preservation Connecticut. Preservation Connecticut is the statewide private nonprofit historic preservation organization founded in 1975 by a special act of the Connecticut General Assembly as the Connecticut Trust for Historic Preservation to preserve, protect, and promote buildings, sites, and landscapes that contribute to the vitality and heritage of Connecticut's communities. We are statutory partners with the State Historic Preservation Office, and I am proud to say that for over 4 decades, we have successfully championed the protection of remarkable community assets all over the state by leveraging funding, advocating, forming partnerships, and promoting stewardship. Our office is on Whitney Avenue in Hamden, Connecticut, and listed on the National Register of Historic Places. Shown here, it's the Eli Whitney Boarding House, built in 1827 to house workers for Eli Whitney's gun factory, and it has served as Preservation Connecticut's headquarters since 1989. We have a staff of 8 preservation professionals and a board of 21 preservationists from around the state. Staff listed here are always available to assist with inquiries. Christopher Wiegren is our Deputy Director. Contact Chris for information on historic preservation easements, our bi-monthly magazine, Connecticut Preservation News, our newly launched Olmsted in Connecticut Landscape Survey Project, or to arrange a book talk for his recently published book, Connecticut Architecture, Stories of 100 Places. Renee Tribert, Making Places and Preservation Services Manager. Please contact Renee for information on redevelopment of historic industrial sites and tax credit applications. Jordan Sorensen is our Development and Special Projects Manager. Jordan manages our communications and outreach to members through social media and email, receives and monitors demolition notices from municipalities, and prepares historic tax credit applications and nominations for state and national register of historic places. Kristen Hopewood, Development Assistant, manages all of the inquiries that come into our office, provides member services, arranges special events, and is the editor of our Historic Properties Exchange, a free listing of threatened historic properties. And finally, our team of circuit riders, Brad Scheid, Mike Farino, and Stacy Barrow, provide immediate boots-on-the-ground service to homeowners, developers, municipal leaders, nonprofit organizations and museums, historic district commissions, and much more, with an array of preservation technical assistance, including community organizing, prioritizing maintenance and repairs, historic designations, and funding. These weekly chats have served as a meaningful way for us to continue our mission during the pandemic. We've been able to connect with the public and hear what's on your mind. Please feel free to use the chat feature to ask questions directly at the end of the presentation, or contact us afterwards for a call or a site visit. This talk today originated as part of a mitigation effort initiated by the environmental review team at the Connecticut State Historic Preservation Office, related to Route 127 safety improvements. It's Route 127 Safety Improvement Project in Bridgeport. The SHPO team came up with this educational component as one of several ways to mitigate the adverse effect of the project on the National Register listed Olmsted designated landscape Beardsley Park under Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act. The memorandum of agreement was spearheaded by the staff at the Connecticut SHPO and signed by the Federal Highway Administration, Connecticut DOT, and Connecticut DEEP, included a stipulation that Connecticut DOT will provide for development of a scholarly treatment of Frederick Law Olmsted's early life and influence on the anti-slavery movement of the 19th century. So that brings us to our speaker today, Dr. Don Poland, a former trustee of Preservation Connecticut. So we are happy to have him back with us, and I'll turn the controls over to you, Don. Welcome.
Thank you for the kind introduction. It's wonderful to be back and interacting with the trust. Just bear with me a moment here while I share my screens. And are you seeing the presentation or my Zoom window?
Yes, I can see it.
Okay.
It's your whole window.
Okay, good. Sometimes for whatever reason it jumps me to my other screen, but so
You're good.
As introduced by Jane, this presentation comes out of a manuscript I essentially produced for the SHPO office related to that mitigation effort, and that manuscript is kind of set up in these sections or topics, and under the title of Unconscious Influence, Olmsted's Hartford. For me, it's a story as much about Hartford as it is about Olmsted. And Unconscious Influence comes from the title of a sermon by Horace Bushnell in 1842 that's been recognized as being greatly influential on Olmsted and Olmsted's work. And we see this quote here: "We must answer not only for what we do with purpose, but for the influences we exert insensibly." And at the end of the day, embedded in Olmsted's work, whatever that work was, but especially with his landscape architecture, it was this idea of unconscious influence, that through the improvement and betterment of the physical environment, he could raise and elevate our status as a society. Not much is known about Olmsted and his youngest years in Hartford. Unfortunately, due to a fire in his Staten Island home later in life, all of his records from pre-18 years old were destroyed. So there's no actual artifacts of Olmsted under the age of 18, like letters and so forth. So most of what biographers have relied on are short sketches that Olmsted wrote about himself and about his younger years. And due to interests in other areas and research I had been kind of playing with over a decade, I kept on seeing this intersection in our American suburban history with Hartford. And things were resonating with me, and things also felt uncomfortable. And as I continued to work my way through it, a larger story essentially evolved. But more important, in the context of Olmsted, it started becoming evident to me how influenced he was by his younger years in Hartford. So I decided to take a different approach, since there weren't any records to go to. And that was to essentially situate Olmsted in Hartford in the first half of the 1800s. So Olmsted is born in April of 1822, and he remains directly connected with Hartford until 1847. In 1847, he moves out of Hartford and down to the Connecticut coast. But he still remains kind of tethered to Hartford up until around 1851, 1852. And that's the launch of his journalism career. So I wanted to take a look at essentially what was going on in Hartford from about approximately 1800 up until about the 1860s, and situate Olmsted within that. So my belief is Olmsted's one of the most influential individuals of the 19th century. Few, if any, had a more significant and lasting impression on our American cultural landscape. The fact is, his designs and work still are evident and viewable across our landscape, and often hide in plain sight, meaning that the majority of society have no idea that they're even interacting with Olmsted landscape. As I already said, little known about his younger years, but essentially my feeling is that a social cultural milieu had started to form in Hartford in probably the late 1700s, the 1790s, and continues on up until kind of the 1870s or so forth. And it's really around social reform and this idea of creating a civil American society. At this point in time, Europe, especially England, looked down at us as a bunch of farmers and ruffians. We don't have the great cities or histories of Europe, no public institutions, museums, and so forth. And therefore, there's multiple individuals in different ways working towards creating this civil American society. And there's a number of very influential individuals in Hartford, or at least in the orbit of Hartford, some of them tied to Yale and New Haven and so forth. Some of the key players are Noah Webster, Timothy Dwight, the Beecher family, all of them, with their residency in Litchfield and then their relocation to Hartford. And basically, I think I can show that from 1822 to 1905, I think there was always at least one or as many as 5 Beechers living in the city of Hartford. And Horace Bushnell, who becomes extremely important in the context of Olmsted, and then other reformers. So I'm going to go through some specific threads in this presentation that are about building out kind of the influence of Hartford on Olmsted and Olmsted's influence ultimately. Olmsted was born, I think this answers one of the pre-submitted questions. Olmsted was born on College Street, today Capitol Avenue, in what was known as the Dodd House. And then there's an 1850s map here that shows, it's a property map, that shows the Dodd House on College Street. And just to give context, Bliss today is Trinity Street. Trinity College today is the state capitol. The Bushnell Theater of Performing Arts is here. The state office building is here. And essentially his house would be sitting in the parking lots behind the state office building that are commonly used for the Bushnell the Bushnell performances. So we're all familiar with the exact birthplace of his childhood. We'll talk about a second home. There was a third home in Hartford that no one's been able to identify where it was or what it was, but this home no longer exists, but the site still does. So what caught my attention was the history of American suburbanization and this idea of the crafting of the American suburban vision in the mid-1800s. So 2 prominent authors, the most cited 2 sources in suburban history, both make comments that very quickly made me uneasy and made me start thinking about if there was something more going on here in Hartford. So Jackson says that the ideas of the house and yard did not enter our nation's consciousness through the effort of any person or group of individuals. And then he says 3 authors during this time frame of 1840 to 1845, including Catherine Beecher, Andrew Jackson Downing, and Calvert Vaux, were the most important voices in shaping our new American attitudes. And Fishman then says the success of the suburban ideal in the mid-century America came from a group of publicists who successfully presented, one might say marketed, the English suburban villa as the ideal American dwelling. Catherine Beecher is the first name that pops out there as being tethered to Hartford. And as I was researching suburbia, continually names from Hartford entered into the suburban histories. And this idea of no group started to kind of rub me wrong in that I was seeing a group. They were a group of evangelicals and a group of Federalists, later Whigs, and a group of a tight-knit social circle in Hartford. And that's where this all started back around 2010 for me. This is just a quick table I've thrown together of on the first 3 columns here. These are all names that surface in American suburban history. Those in red are people that I know for a fact Olmsted had a direct relationship. Those in blue are people that he likely had a relationship with, but I have not been able to pin down as of yet. And then there's local actors in Hartford who never made it into our bigger history of suburbia, but who are extremely influential and ultimately were within this circle of Frederick Law Olmsted. The crafting of the American suburban ideal or suburban vision comes from this idea that four areas of thought that were prominent in the time kind of collided together. The promotion of holy domesticity, picturesque and natural landscapes, including design, but also like the Hudson River landscape painters and so forth. The country cottage or villa, and the ornamental garden or lawns. And when you then look at these four distinct categories, you start seeing that Bushnell, or Catherine Beecher, Horace Bushnell, Harriet Beecher Stowe are the leading proponents in here, even Timothy Dwight. Picturesque landscapes ultimately draw in other actors, but include Frederick Law Olmsted. Cottage village and design, we start seeing local actors. We see these designs in the Hartford landscape early and so forth. In ornamental lawns, the most predominant individual was Jacob Vietherman, who ultimately designed Bushnell Park, worked for the city of Hartford, designed Cedar Hill Cemetery, and also was a colleague of Olmsted's. So you start seeing this orbit of people in American suburban history from Hartford arise and be influential. The suburb was believed to be separated or have to be separated beyond the edge of the city, blending city and country together. And this was an Olmstedian idea that it was this blending of the benefits of the countryside and the benefits of the city into one place, in the division of home and work. And we go from essentially the country cottage here to the suburban track house here of more modern times. And I put Olmsted's Riverside design in there because we'll look at it a bit later on in more detail. So in Hartford, there's an early property and estate that I think has been missed in our suburban histories. And it's extremely influential both locally in Hartford and on a much broader scale at a national level, even to the extent that like an English China company produced china with images of Montevideo. So Montevideo was the estate of Daniel Wadsworth. It existed on Talcott Mountain on the north side of Route 44. And it was essentially in the Western District of Hartford at that time before the incorporation of West Hartford and Avon. These are sketches taken from a book by Benjamin Silliman, a professor from Yale, who was a brother-in-law to Wadsworth. And the two of them took a walk from Hartford to Quebec in 1819, and he wrote a book about their walk. The first chapter starts at Montevideo, and he explains this glorious, picturesque landscape. And ultimately, Olmsted talks about, you know, these journeys with his family across the Connecticut countryside and beyond, seeking out the picturesque and reading Silliman's book as kind of a guide to finding these landscapes. So we know that Silliman is influential, and ultimately when Olmsted goes to Yale, he actually takes classes with Silliman. So we have this direct tie there. And Silliman writes of Montevideo, he writes, national character often receives its peculiar cast from natural scenery. Thus, natural scenery is intimately connected with taste, moral feeling, utility, and instruction. It's these vocabularies, this idea of national character and natural scenery and taste and moral feelings and so forth, that become embedded in the Hartford community. And I'll show examples of it showing up in editorials in the Hartford Current in the mid-century and so forth. And it also shows up in Olmsted's writing itself, especially when he wrote this report about Yosemite for the state of California. And you can see its influence there. The reason why I'm surprised that it's missed in suburban history is because the two most important books at the start of that period of the American suburban vision that are cited to are Catherine Beecher's book on domesticity and Andrew Jackson Downing's book on the practice of landscape gardening. And these are viewed as these two monumental treatises on these topics that influence the crafting of this vision. Well, Montevideo is used as an example in Catherine's book, and it's referenced in short in Andrew Jackson Downing's book. Other research has shown that the Gothic was the ultimate symbol of the Christian home at this point in time, and that Montevideo was possibly the earliest Gothic revival house in New England. So we have a substantial site well predating the emergence of this period. And essentially what I'm doing is I'm tracing back through saying, were these four components of the suburban vision evident in Hartford and when? And they all actually appear and are evident, and they start coalescing by the time we reach the early 1840s, which says there's this kind of origin before this period occurring in this place that we call Hartford. The graphic on the left comes from Catherine Beecher's treatise. It is a representation of a Gothic cottage on that property. And we see another period context painting of the Montevideo property. So in the context of Hartford, as I said, kind of tracing the suburban in the context of Frederick Law Olmsted and Horace Bushnell, because they are the two key actors or most prominent actors in this story, which I'll explain more about. But here we have an editorial from 1845, a visitor from Boston who writes to the Hartford Daily Current. There is more taste displayed in the buildings here than has been formerly in Boston in that vicinity, nor are the people quite so careful about room, meaning large lots of space. There are very great advantages to building here, and they have been improved by gentlemen of taste and property. Almost every house has what may be properly called a garden. And this is an image, a painting from 1845 on College Street looking at the Trinity College campus. This property would have been about five lots away from the Dodd House where Olmsted was born 20 years prior to. We see the picture, the ornamental lawn, the picket fence, the gentleman tending to his garden, and we can start to see that these suburban forms that ultimately Olmsted becomes so known for are evident in the city he's growing up in. So Olmsted's second house was on Ann Street. Maybe some irony here, but if we were to go out to this location today, we would be standing on Ann Street above I-84. Essentially, I-84 goes under where the Olmsted house would have been. That being said, the Olmsted house was long gone before the interstate highway system was ever constructed, so it was not removed for that. But Horace Bushnell builds a house. Horace Bushnell has his first home in 1833 on Ann Street. And Frederick Law Olmsted's father purchases a house on Ann Street also. They were next door neighbors to each other. In the next slide, it's revealed that when Bushnell moves further out, John Olmsted, Frederick's father, purchases the property. And here we see the two side-by-side Olmsted properties. One would have been the Bushnells, one was the Olmsteds. They both end up being the Olmsteds. I'm not sure which is which. But we do have the location of what was primarily his childhood home that he lived in, or a substantial teenage home for Olmsted ultimately. And Bushnell moves out to a street that he created called Winthrop Street. It's not very far, it's only a few blocks away, but it's an outward movement into an undeveloped area. And his daughter, in her writings about him, states he was ridiculed for his choice of a site in the fields. So even back then, persons were ridiculed for suburban expansion. That, how could he leave the populated city and move outwards? And here we see the reference ultimately to the Olmsteds bought the Bushnell's Ann Street house. These are two photographs of buildings This is the John Bull House, which is on Ann Street, and we see it here. I'm trying to provide context of the architecture of the detached house, the individual lot, which would have been only 2 properties away from the Olmsted property. So this neighboring property is the Bruce, and then the Olmsted's property would have been there. 1 block behind was Lydia Sigourney's property, and we see it here. And we can see this maybe a little more of a suburban style. This may be more of a village style, like what we anticipate in a Mystic. But we're starting to see this form of the yard and garden. But this location becomes important because what I surface in Hartford is a forgotten property called the High Street Garden. So through my research, I discovered this place, and if admiration of the beautiful things of nature has the tendency to soften and refine character. So here we see those Silliman vocabularies. The culture of them is still more powerful and abiding. And if he who devotes his leisure to cultivating the works of nature benefits himself, who beautifies a garden for the eye of the community is surely a public benefactor. He furnishes pure ailments for that taste which refines character. Once again, this refining character, the unconscious influence and the vocabularies of Silliman. And this neighborhood is in the heart of the city. This would be Union Station. And it is the block behind the Olmsteds. We now see it here. It's listed as the C.F. Pond property. And we discover a gentleman by the name of Dr. E.W. Bull. And Bull beautified his garden situated on High Street. It's 15 acres. Great undulations of surface. The grounds are laid out in the picturesque style. And another editorial, any plan for ornamenting and beautifying Hartford was always found in him, a warm and native and consistent friend. And the High Street Garden combines in a remarkable degree the charms of nature and art, which are distinguished cities of Europe. Here we see that European reference, as well as some of our own land, are found to have refining effects upon national character. Same vocabularies. We are 2 decades on, and the Silliman vocabularies are embedded in this Hartford community. And here's the Olmsted property, and here's the Bull property. And here's the big kicker to it all. Oh, not yet. Just another example, 1853, already the use of every suburban garden in the city. The relationship to Bull, comparing Bull to A.J. Downing as influential in this horticulture and landscape design. And then the melding here of the domesticity with the design, that the parents are beginning to appreciate how powerful the influence of home may be increased over their children. So we start seeing all this stuff has come together in the first half of the 18th century. But here's the kicker. Edward Bull, or Ebenezer Bull, is the brother of Mary Ann Bull. She is Olmsted's stepmom, who raises him from approximately the age of 5. So now we have this direct connection between Olmsted and a leading horticulturalist who's publishing in the various magazines, who knows Downing and so forth, and is introducing this vegetative beauty to the city of Hartford. This is the Olmsted gravesite in the North Cemetery. The left-hand side of the gravesite is the Watson and Bull family. The Olmsteds are here. This is Frederick there. Sorry that I cut him off. And additional family members over here on the left-hand side. It's a joint site of these multiple families sharing it together. So now we have Olmsted embedded in this kind of emergence of picturesque landscapes and gardening and horticulture within Hartford through his family ties. So in the context of the emergence of the suburb, Fishman explains that a true suburb, however, is more than the edge of the city inhabited largely by the middle class. It must embody the design of marriage of town and country. And once again, this is an Olmstedian viewpoint that is being drawn from by Fishman, a distinct zone apart from both solid rows of city streets and from rural fields. And two early suburbs, Llewellyn Park, New Jersey, 12 miles outside of New York City, designed in the late 1850s, and Riverside, designed by Olmsted in 1868. But when we come to Hartford, it's actually Mark Twain's Nook Farm, or it well predates Mark Twain by 2 decades. John Hooker, the husband of Isabella Beecher Hooker, we now have another Hooker coming into play here, another Beecher coming into play here. We've got Catherine, we've got Harriet with domesticity. Now we have Isabella Beecher, also part of this Nook Farm community. Along with Frances Gillette, they purchased 100 acres outside the city. In this letter from Gillette in his archives, in the archives at the Harriet Beecher Stowe House, says that I might have an occupation and home conveniently near to the city privileges while I reside in a garden. So this suburban idea is embedded in his decision to purchase Nook Farm, as that letter is a year before they actually purchased the land. In this 1877 lithograph, this is the Mark Twain house, the Harriet Beecher Stowe house, in the Nook Farm community. Some interesting narratives around Nook Farm in editorials here. We took a drive through and found delightful broad gravel road that leads from Forest Street. Nook Farm has many desirable locations, buildings. Hooker has a beautiful cottage in Perkins, who is married to Mary Beecher. We now have another Beecher commingled in this location. The grounds are laid out in a neat and tasteful manner. Nook Farm can't be beat for its desirable locations to all those who like love in a cottage and that sort of thing. Twain, I go a bit later because Twain becomes interesting to me. Having grown up in the Hartford area, being embedded in the Hartford region, you can't exist here without having heard the famous quote, of all the beautiful towns it's been my fortune to see, Hartford is the chief. And everywhere that eye turns is blessed with a vision of refreshing green. You don't know what beauty is if you have not been here. Well, what I never knew until I started doing this research was that's the first and last sentence of a paragraph. And it's actually what comes in between is more interesting than the quote, because he's describing Hartford, which he's seeing now in August of 68 for the second time. His first visit, I believe, was in January of 68. The city of 40,000 inhabitants, composed almost entirely of dwelling houses. No shingle-shaped affairs stood on end and packed together like a deck of cards, read townhouses. But massive private hotels scattered along the broad streets from 50 all the way up to 200 yards apart. Each house sits in the midst of an acre of green grass or flower beds or ornamental shrubbery, guarded on all sides by trimmest hedges of abrevieties, by files of huge forest trees that cast shadows like thunderclouds. Some of these stately dwellings are almost buried from sight in parks and forests of these noble trees. He's describing suburbia. He's not describing a city, an urban environment. And I think he's doing it because he's experiencing it as something different from all the other cities he's seen. This is his front fence of his front yard, and this is a property across the street from it. When we see massive private hotels, this helps to explain it. And he built a massive private hotel for himself. But the suburban historians also say that our modern American suburb is a small private island with backyards functioning as wholesome, family-oriented, and reclusive places. Well, here's Mark Twain with the wife and 3 kids, the family dog on the back porch in the backyard. So the American suburban is fully established in both a physical form and a social, cultural form by the time we hit basically 1870s, and Mark Twain's living it here in Hartford. So how's this all relate to Olmsted? At the end of the day, Olmsted is key in the emergence of this American suburban vision and spreading these landscape design ideals across the country. Bushnell ultimately is the most influential person on Olmsted. And when you read Bushnell's sermons and essays in the context of Olmsted's work, and if you read Olmsted's writings in the context of Bushnell's writings, if you do them side by side, you start realizing there's no way not to recognize this influence of Bushnell onto Olmsted. Some of the most notable essays, as I already mentioned, Unconscious Influence, 1842. The Day of Roads is about the need to tether the Western frontier to civilized society via roads, both dirt and rail. Prosperity, Our Duty is this amazing look at what I call a theological approach to economic development. The arrival of the rail destroys Hartford's docks and port, and ultimately Bushnell doesn't like the decay, and he writes this sermon about prosperity, our duty, and a call to action to improve the economics of Hartford. Barbarism in the First Degree, the first danger, is his reaction to a trip he took out west to California in seeing the frontier and kind of the lack of moral standards and so forth. And then essay that was written in 54, published in 64. It was written as Planning of Cities. It was published as a chapter in the book Work and Play by Bushnell under the title City Plans. I'm going to use city plans or planning of cities as one example of showing how Bushnell influences Olmsted. I essentially view them as Bushnell being the mentor and theorist, and Olmsted being the student and then practitioner. And Olmsted formulates Bushnell's ideas into his own and then takes them out to society through his work. So in Planning of Cities, Bushnell explains that that the city will be most perfectly planned when it makes a world for itself and reveals its ornaments, their needs in order to the most pleasing and picturesque effect, to be an impression produced by growth and extension. I'm honing in on these vocabularies of ornamentation, picturesque. This is all suburban vocabularies. And that the rectangular plan is the enemy of all convenience. This is the New York City grid, the Philadelphia grid, even the 9 squares of New Haven, that he's revolting against the rectangular. And in modern times, especially our own country, there's remarkable distinction that we have it given so often to locate a city. And there's nothing left but to spread our cities out where we want them to be. And then this additional statement, the spread of a new modern city with broad, straight avenues and ample house lots fronted with trees in a manner of a new American city. This becomes more profound when we actually get to Olmsted. So here's the Riverside Plan, and we're reading Bushnell's words next to it. Accepting thus far that the lines of nature, which will commonly be curvilinear, not the grid, and will make irregular angles with each, the skeleton of the plan that is to be is made out, and the filling up only remains. Continue. And this will be done by a rectangular block work adjusted by some principal straight lines along the natural summits and ridges between low and high grounds and their avenues. These principal straight line streets having positions of dignity will be the broadways of the plan. Olmsted is famous for his boulevards. Those were the straight streets. And Riverside is a rectangular blockwork without 90-degree angles at the intersections, following the contours, the natural contours of the land. It's imposing the curvilinear upon the existing environment. He essentially used Bushnell's words to create this design of Riverside. This lengthy paragraph here, I'm not going to read in full. And every time I read it, I want to do it in this kind of thunderous voice of a Bushnell doing his sermon. Because it starts, most human errors are amended by repentance, but here there are no amendments, and advantage lost cannot be recovered. He ends with ultimately saying, we can have cities for the new age that has come, adapted to the better condition of use and ornament. So great an advantage ought not be thrown away. We want, therefore, a city planning profession. Every new village, town, city ought to be contrived as a work of art and prepared for the new age of ornament to come. I basically say that Olmsted took these words and took us into the new age of ornament to come. And it's ironic that Daniel Burnham, giving credit to Olmsted near the end of Olmsted's career, says an artist paints with lakes and wooden slopes and lawns and banks and forest-covered hills, with mountainsides and ocean views. He should stand where I do tonight, not for the deeds of later years alone, but for what his brain has wrought and his pen has taught for half a century. I feel like there's bookends here. It's the start to Olmsted's career, and it's the recognition of the artist creating our cities and places as a work of art, whether that be a park or whether that be a riverside suburban community. I'll end, as the book does, the manuscript does, on slavery, because that was kind of the driving force behind this work in the mitigation. So Olmsted's first career between 1852 and 1857 was as a travel writer and journalist. And in that short time, he became a prolific and influential of those travel writers who published accounts of their visits to the South. So during 2 trips spanning 14 months into the South, he wrote 75 long letter descriptions to the New York Daily Times and the New York Daily Tribune. So it was serial versions or accounts of what he was experiencing in the South. Those were then published into 2 large volumes, Southern Travels, Journey of the Seaboard Slave States, and The Journey Through Texas. And ultimately in 1857, he republished an account by an English author with a long introduction and supplement to it. And then in 1861, there's an English version that's kind of the abridged copy of the 3 prior volumes produced as the Cotton Kingdom Travel and Observations. His writings at this period were recognized by so many. People like Dickens commented on it. Harriet Beecher Stowe recognized it as outstanding. And the abolitionists adopted it. And behind Harriet Beecher Stowe, he's probably the most influential writer of the time, galvanizing anti-slavery support in the North, leading up to ultimately the Civil War. But he's a challenging individual in this sense. The Hartford community was firmly anti-slavery, as was Olmsted. He was opposed to it. He supported it in no way. But the views were split between the emancipationists and the abolitionists. The emancipationists believed in ending slavery, but did not believe in doing it immediately, and that they couldn't see a path as to how to do it. The abolitionists wanted it gone, abolished immediately. So Olmsted, like Bushnell, his views are very similar, almost identical to Bushnell, as we see in other writings. Other areas like city planning and so forth, was an emancipationist and a gradualist, as was Bushnell. They basically wanted slavery to go away, but they felt you had to end new slavery now, no more new slaves, and generationally allow the slaves to wane and go away, that it would be a gradual process of reaching this point. Bushnell wrote in 1830s, I think it was 1839, sermon that was just horrendous and outright racist, just awful. And he was attacked. Francis Gillette ripped him apart in a counter essay and so forth. And Olmsted's views tracked really closely with Bushnell, and Olmsted was also racist, but not to the same degree as Bushnell. But there's a complexity here because the two of them are evolving and are learning. And Bushnell in the early 1840s writes an essay which shows he's grown drastically. He does not have the extreme views of the 1830s. And so forth. And both of them ultimately soften over time. In the end, they end up on the right side of history as we lead into the Civil War and so forth. They both do support abolition. They don't support the abolitionists. They still think their tactics and ways are, uncivil and so forth, but they become supporters and so forth. But regardless of their own views, the fact is you can't take away from Olmsted's influence on galvanizing anti-slavery support in the North. He's one of the most influential individuals, and his writings of the South are just so vivid and wonderful if you have a chance to read them. In conclusion, ultimately, and there's so much more included within the manuscript, in conclusion, Olmsted is a product of Hartford. The fact is, everything he was doing through his career, I can trace back into the Hartford community and what was going on during the period of time that he grows up. He's also in the middle of this circle. So we find out that his father was on the board of trustees for the founding of the Wadsworth Athenaeum, was a friend with Daniel Wadsworth, and so forth, that the Bushnells and the Beechers had really close ties, and so forth. He's embedded in this community that's striving towards various forms of social reform. So ultimately, it's Hartford that frames kind of his work and his life and had a profound influence, an unconscious influence on our American cultural landscape, that the origins of his thoughts and practices rest here in the city with an ethos and cultural milieu that went on at that period. I'll end there, and I'm willing to take questions. I should say I'm available to take questions.
Thanks, Don. That was fantastic. How long have you been doing this research?
On and off. I mean, it started in 2010. My PhD then got in the way of it. So there was probably a period from I started my PhD in 2009. I finished it in 2015. There was probably a period from 2013 to 2015 that I didn't touch any of this. And then I got back into it in around 2016 or so. And there's still so many threads I want to go down. But in some ways, it's been overwhelming in that every time I go down a rabbit hole, I go down the rabbit hole. Just all these other things pop out and come into play. So there's still so much more to be done here, I believe. So.
Great. Pat, you have your hand raised. You have a question?
I do. I'd like to, first of all, Dawn, I found your presentation absolutely thrilling. And my question to you is there a book in the works?
I don't know. I mean, one, I'm hopeful Shippo will get the manuscript published and out next year, at least for Connecticut exposure. I do keep on saying there's a much larger story here that I'd like to write. Unfortunately, earning a living and doing my work gets in the way of what's become an overwhelming kind of hobby. But maybe someday. So
I think it's just absolutely fascinating and important work. And I hope you do find a way to publish journal articles or ultimately a book. Thank
Great.
you for this amazing afternoon presentation. Thank you.
Thanks, Patricia. Jane, if you don't mind, I know there were some pre-submitted questions. So someone asked, where did he get his training to design landscapes? To be honest with you, he's self-trained. He did work as an apprentice with a civil engineer for a short period of time. So he learned about surveying and measurement and so forth. But essentially, it's the vast library that the Wadsworth Athenaeum had on landscape design, and an uncle of his in East Hartford who had a large personal library that ultimately ended up in the Wadsworth collection, where he was exposed to the great landscape works of Europe and essentially self-taught himself, which is pretty amazing. It just seems when you look at him, basically, if he put his mind to it, he could do everything he wanted to do. But he didn't leave his home until he was 25, which was very rare at that point in time. That was very old. So it's kind of like he floundered and floundered, unable to figure out what he wanted to do. But once he figured it out, oh, he did it well. So.
There was a question that just came in the chat, Don. Are you planning any walking tours for Olmsted 2020?
Nothing specific as of yet, but I guess I'll just put out there, I'm open to any organization that's doing events around Olmsted 200. I'm more than welcome to participate and provide walking tours if needed, especially since I have a long history of doing walking tours. So
fascinating. Put you on our list.
There was another pre-question asked, did any of the homes in Hartford or East Hartford survive? As I already showed in Hartford, no, they did not. There was a third place of residence between College Street and Ann Street. It's unknown. My guess is it's also gone because, to be honest with you, the overwhelming majority of the city of the first half of the 1800s is gone. Was gone before urban renewal. Urban renewal is kind of the second round of demolition in the city of Hartford. So no, and as far as I know, no, I'm not aware of an Olmsted property remaining in East Hartford. One thing I will say though, Olmsted's Staten Island house remains. It's owned by the city, and it is dilapidated and falling apart in an awful condition, and it's an absolute shame. And in the context of the National Trust and their most threatened properties, it really should be on the list because it's shameful that the city of New York owns it and has just allowed it to become a boarded up structure on an overgrown lot. So. Is there another chat question here?
Yes. During the summers, Olmsted spent time at resort hotels on the east shore of New Haven Harbor near Lighthouse Point. This was actually where he first heard of the Central Park design opportunity from a fellow traveler. Have you researched anything about his summer stays in New Haven?
I'm not sure about his summer stays, and there might be some aspects of history might be conflated, and it's escaping me right now, but it was. One is he had relatives in Branford, I believe it was, that he spent summer times with. Oddly enough, I believe those relatives were also related to the Beechers. So he spent some summers in his teenage years in that area down along the coast with family. His father then bought him a farm on the Connecticut shore where he tried his hand at being a gentleman farmer. And there's accounts of his summer times down there in Bushnell, visiting him and going sailing and so forth. This resort thread I'm not familiar with. I'm not saying it doesn't exist. It just hasn't surfaced in my research, and I will now search it out to see if there's more to it. In the context of a bigger story, I think there's a bigger role of New Haven and Yale in all of this storylines and so forth. So it's not just Hartford. I'm looking at the other preset questions or present questions. The connection to Cheshire, once again, Olmsted had relatives in Cheshire. So Olmsted's families were there was an Olmsted ancestor that was one of the original 100 families that settled Hartford. So he goes all the way back to the Hooker era in his lineage. The family then spread out across the region, and there were Olmsteds in East Hartford. His father grew up in East Hartford and then moved back to Hartford when he opened his business. There were Olmsteds out in Canton. There were Olmsteds in Cheshire. And some of the famous kind of stories of Olmsted's childhood that he wrote about was essentially the walks with his brother from Hartford to Cheshire and Hartford to Collinsville to essentially go visit relatives. It's kind of amazing when, we just don't walk in that way, or, Wadsworth and Silliman walking to Quebec, and Bushnell essentially walked to San Francisco. He was in such ailing health and pain that riding the horse-drawn carriage was more painful than walking, that he walked behind the carriage from here to Minnesota. To this day, I still can't comprehend those journeys. And especially Olmsted as a little child at like 9 years old, walking Hartford to Cheshire and so forth. But it's what he did. So there was immediate family in Cheshire.
Great, thank you. Did anyone else have a question before we close? This is just fascinating, Don.
Thank you. And thanks to everyone for showing up and listening. And I'm always available if anyone would like to talk further about Olmsted. So,
do you mind if we share your slide deck with everyone?
No, not at all. I will PDF it and get it emailed back to you. So
That'd be wonderful. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, everyone. Have a great day.
Thanks, Don. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Thanks, Pat.